Please welcome Alan Blue.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alan Blue. I'm one of the co-founders here, and I'm also work on the product. I'm a vice president of product here. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of the LinkedIn Speaker Series. We put these on a regular basis to try to bring some of the smartest and most thoughtful people here to LinkedIn. People who are going to be able to talk about the stuff that matters to us as a company, but also matters to the vision and mission that we have in the world. And for those of you watching online, and even those here, if you want to go to speakers.linkedin.com, you can check all the old ones and see what's coming up on our speaker series. So as you all know, the question around the future of work is a big deal for us here at LinkedIn. Not only do we concern ourselves with where we are today, but because we are members first, because we want to make each individual successful, to provide each individual with economic opportunity, we also want to think about what the future of work is. And the future is both easier to see and harder to see than it ever has been. Technology is changing things very, very rapidly. And there are beginning to emerge a set of voices around the world who are beginning to think about these topics. And we are very pleased today to have two of those voices, two of the people who had originally started talking about what it means when machines begin to act, and they'll talk more about it, begin to act not just in lieu of our muscles, but also in lieu of our brains. And what does that mean for us on a go-forward basis? So it's the author of two books, both from MIT, and people who have had the pleasure of working with and speaking with on many occasions. Erik Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, please come on up. And my co-founder, Reid Hoffman, is going to engage them in conversation. Enjoy.
So the fortunate thing is we're at least a few years off from machines replacing our ability to do these panel conversations. So in terms of brains. So just so everyone knows, I've been a fan of Andy and Erik's for a long time. I think their work is really important. If you actually haven't read it, I recommend it.
And just so you all know, our main strategy is to talk to Reid whenever we can and in secret transcribe what he says.
And was a secret.
Yeah, sorry. And put covers on it and try to sell copies.
Plastics. And so let's start with, so why did you write this book? What's your target? What are you trying to do? As we know, most of the LinkedIn audience knows the three transformations that are happening, but why did you write this book?
Well, I think we're in the early stages of a huge revolution. Andy and I have been looking at the way technology has been transforming so much of the economy, and all of you in this room have been working to lead a lot of this transformation. But what may not be as obvious to you is the way the rest of the world, the rest of the economy is being changed. And we're at a business school and looking at the companies that are being disrupted, that are being transformed, and we look ahead and we see the next 10 years as potentially being the best 10 years in human history or some of the worst 10 years, because there's just some huge challenges. And the gap that we seek to address is not that the technology isn't moving fast enough. You guys are doing a great job on that. It's that the rest of us aren't keeping up with it, that the economics is way behind, the human institutions, the organizations. And so in our previous book, Second Machine Age, we talked a lot about the disruption that's coming, the bounty that's being created, but also the inequality that's being created. And this one, we're looking at these three great rebalancings, these three great trends, reshapings, I think Reid says would be a better word than rebalancings, between mind and machine, product and platform, and the core and the crowd. And this triple revolution is going to change the way a lot of businesses need to be run, the way a lot of people reskill themselves, and the way we think about society more broadly.
After Erik and I wrote The Second Machine Age, we went on the road, we talked about it a lot, and we kept on noticing that we're having the same hallway conversation over and over, which is you'd go off stage and we'd be accosted in the hallway by somebody saying essentially, I run a medium-sized to big company in industry X. I believe the story that you're telling. What do I do now? How do I think about the world? How do I think about my business, my industry differently? It was a great question, And Erik and I are both business school guys, and we kind of thought it's incumbent on us, this is what we're supposed to do, to try to provide answers to that question. The problem was we didn't know the answer to that question at that time, which was a little bit scary, but also a great opportunity because the two of us get to go into a room with a whiteboard and try to figure stuff out, talk to some of our favorite geek friends out there in the world, and honestly try to answer this question.
And actually, that's one of the reasons why we're here. We're literally looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion from Reid, but from all of you, so we can hear more questions about things that we should be thinking about and getting to work on. It's another one of our secret formulas to try to do better work is to hear from some of the best and the brightest about what you're seeing.
And when we went out into the world, we knew that we had talked about some number of things that were happening, and one is not enough. And I got really good advice early in my career from somebody who said, if you ever find yourself on stage saying, and sixthly, you're in a lot of trouble. Right? So 6 is too many. It has to be like a finite number of things that people can get their minds around. And that's where this idea of three rebalancings, 3 reshapings came from. The good news is that, as Erik and I kept talking to each other, we learned that there are 3 separate bodies of Nobel Prize winning economic work that have a huge amount to say about the stuff that's happening today. So the economic backbone in the book is one of the things that I'm proudest of.
So I think I'm a word pedant today. It's not a secret when you announce it to the web, but in terms of strategy.
It
was a secret.
This panel is secrets revealed.
Yes, exactly. So what are some of the things that, there's obviously, as traditional industries and traditional companies look at the transformation that's happening with technology, they have this kind of massively quick changing of within the world of software, artificial intelligence, the platforms, the deployment of the crowd. They have a need for a different skill basis, a need for a different strategy for the business, a different decisioning, different approach to data. There's obviously lots of things to do and don't, right? So like one of the pieces of advice is not, everyone should go try to become an AI first company next year because that would be a mistake, even though AI is going to transform all industries. So what are some of the kind of as it were, the cheat sheet on the do's and the don'ts for kind of the traditional industry folks?
Well, let me dive in with one of them, which is they should be a lot more data-driven, a lot more AI-driven. No, not everyone's going to become LinkedIn or Google or whatever. But if you, in terms of resetting the dial, our experience, we looked at case after case, is most companies, most organizations are not nearly data intensive enough, not nearly technology intensive enough, and too many decisions are being made by human judgment. And we spent time talking to, he mentioned Nobel Prize winners, people like Danny Kahneman, and we were just astonished by the number of human foibles and mistakes and judgment and decision making that happen over and over. They're systematically.
There are about 175 entries.
We're going to run through all of them today.
Right, and 175ly.
Not 6, but 175.
In the Wikipedia entry for human cognitive bias.
And so people are, one of the first ones is people are way overconfident in their own judgment. So we look at, just
raise your hand if you have below average judgment. I'm serious, right? Your founder, right?
But just looking at our industry, so we did a bunch of studies, ourselves, and looked at how if you did more data-driven decision making, you could do a lot better. And I just very briefly, pointed our own decision making and the mistakes we made. We tenure people and we promote people based on this committee that sits around and makes our human judgments. And along with some grad students and some people at the Operations Research Center, we did a little analysis, we call it Moneyball for professors, where if you just took a bunch of data about citations and publications and other kinds of data, and you did some more sophisticated analytics on those, and you could predict who should be getting tenure and who didn't. You compare the list that the model created with the list of people who actually got created, they overlapped about 70, 75% of the time, so pretty good comparing it. But what's most interesting is that the ones that it disagreed on, the model, those people did substantially better in terms of having high impact research. Their research got more citations, had more impact, got into higher things in the subsequent years. So if you wanted to have tenure people who did great research, you would have been better off just going with the model. Now, our book is a little more nuanced than that. We don't say just throw out the human decision making, but
this was actually a debate that Erik and I had, because I'm kind of the school that you should throw out the human decision making, and Erik has a little more fondness for our wetware than I do.
I think you need an algorithm to make your point.
I kept on citing actual evidence where he's like, no, screw all that. My judgment's great.
If you had generated a model that showed that, I might have been convinced. But yeah, this was that's part of the fun of writing the paper, writing the books and papers with Andy, is that we had these creative tension and debates. And I remember these discussions we had over lunch where we sat down and I think we came to sort of a meeting of the minds that, as I said in the opening, using a lot more data and models would be very, very beneficial. I still don't think that we can just go all the way that way for most problems, but many of them would be way better off turning the dial a lot further in that direction.
Reid, I think the single most common failure mode that I see among enterprises around the world that we've worked with is the managers, the leaders of those companies still think a big part of their job is to be the gatekeeper of ideas, to pass judgment on the ideas that might make it out into the world or not. And they do that based on their gut, their experience, their expertise, their whatnot. Our favorite business acronym is HIPPO, which stands for Highest Paid Person's Opinion. And it's how most decisions get made in most places. And when we go around and talk to super geeky companies, the thing that I think I'm most impressed by is how the people that run those companies are trying to get out of the hippo business and trying to create a culture that lets the evidence speak, that has an honest conversation about what are we going to do, and tries to be a lot less hippo-driven.
When I was doing some of the conversations behind the book that I think I'll be publishing this year, Blitzscaling, you guys have seen early drafts of it. Actually, on this thing, one of the interesting things I discovered was the way that Bezos manages, he says, look, if it's an opinion, it's my opinion.
Right.
Sure. But if you have data, you can overwhelm my opinion.
Right.
So part of his attempt to kind of make that drive is if I disagree with you, bring data. And so like one of the more interesting examples of that was the Amazon feature of asking customers to write in almost like Wikipedia-like information about the products. Bezos thought that was a terrible idea. So what they did is they literally they papered it. They emailed 1,000 people, created a little website, had people type in, and brought in we did 1,000 emails, this is what we got, here's what the data looks like.
True story?
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
That's great advice, actually, and that's one of the things we talk a little bit about in the book as well, is this culture of experimentation and A/B testing. You know, scientists have been doing this for a long time, the experimental method, but businesses outside of LinkedIn and Silicon Valley, it's fairly rare, Amazon, to do those kinds of tests. But it's so often now, because of the digital infrastructure we have now, that you can, instead of debating in a room and people, having my opinion versus your opinion, you say, well, let's run an experiment, let's run a test. And it could be a strong one like that, or if you have a website, sometimes you guys run, I don't know how many hundreds of A/B tests each week.
My single favorite example of that we put in the book is we came out here and we interviewed Vish, the CEO of Udacity, and he said they were employing people to review code that students submitted as part of their courses. And one of the engineers said, wait a minute, we have alums out there from all of our courses. Why don't we just contract with them to review other people's code? And Vish says, I was like, hey, go try it. Go see if tapping into the crowd in that way will work. And what I loved about that was he didn't even attempt to exercise his own, like, that seems like a good idea to me kind of
But that's rare. I mean, people like him and Jeff Bezos and you guys are the exception,
incredibly
not the rule.
rare.
We spend most of our time, 90%, talking to the CEOs of the rest of the economy, and it's a real cultural shift to move away from being a hippo to saying, okay, I'm going to step back and let the data speak. In fact, that would be one of our biggest pieces of advice. It's not so much the technology; it's that culture of how you make decisions that needs to change.
Have you been thinking about creating, or have you already created a new course at the Sloan School?
Several. In fact,
decisioning? This kind of decision?
Yes.
A little bit, yeah. So there's three courses that I've been teaching that are sort of touching on this. So one's a PhD course where we get into all that. There's an MBA course, Economics of Information. I'm going into battle next year, so Andy's taking it over next year. And then there's a third course called the Analytics Lab, which is all about project-based analytics projects. So we team up with a bunch of different companies from around the world. They give us very large data sets. And in September, the students make teams, and they work with these 20 million items data sets, and they spend the next 3 months analyzing them. And in December, we spend the whole day having the students present back to the companies what they discovered. And every single one last year, and almost every year, they significantly outperformed what the companies were able to do with that data and came up with new insights.
This is important. I taught at Harvard Business School for a decade before I came back to Sloan. And I look back on that decade, and all I was encouraging students to do was be incredibly fond of their own judgment after reading an 8-page case about a complex business situation and go out there and I was populating the world with hippos.
Well, but this is precisely the thing that's interesting, is you would think the classic MBA methodology popularized by Harvard is the case study.
Yeah.
And you think you would entirely change that methodology based on the advice that you're giving, which strikes me as extremely sound.
Working on it.
Yes,
I would-
okay, got it.
I would
And
have
that was the basis.
No,
of the
I
question.
think so. Actually, if you were to look at, it wasn't not just our course, if you looked at the Sloan School,
Yeah.
MIT, we are much more project-based, data-driven, and moving away from either just sort of the traditional lecture style or the traditional case style. Now, much more of the projects are, we call them action learning, where you
Yes.
are working with data and putting in place some of these principles in real-world situations.
Do you have any, and this is a little bit off the cuff, but LinkedIn is also trying to help solve this problem because, roughly speaking, whether it's information from the news feed, whether it's, LinkedIn Learning, and Lynda, it's how do we have people continually adapt the new skill sets to be successful in any industry, right? It's kind of as a primary mission across all of LinkedIn. In this intersection between the stuff that we're doing and the stuff that you guys are kind of highlighting, in addition to obviously saying, look, be experimental, orient towards data, use judgment, but factor data into your judgment, right? Fundamentally, don't think it's my intuition is the important thing as much as my judgment of data is the important thing. Is there anything that you think that LinkedIn could be doing that you would think of? And this is a little bit of kind of an on-the-spot question, and so it may be but that's something that we also treat as a very fundamental mission.
I don't want you guys to get swelled heads, but you guys are maybe best positioned of anybody to address this kind of problem. You have data on all the jobs people are doing, how they move from one to the other, what the career ladders are, what the skill gaps are. I think you could be doing a lot more. I know you're getting the salary data and everything, but you are very, very well positioned to understand these skill gaps, which we haven't talked much about it here in the panel, but in our books, we talk a lot about the way that there's a growing mismatch between the skills that are needed, the human capital versus what the technology or what the people are doing. In fact, quick anecdote, the way we first met Reid was at Oxford University some years ago. We wrote a short little pamphlet type book called Race Against the Machine, and we had a debate at the Silicon Valley comes to Oxford. And it was very much around this topic about how there was a skill
The single
mismatch.
smartest decision we made was to let Reid be the anchor person for our debate team.
There were 4 people on the team. We were lucky. The 3 of us, we were all
won.
the same team.
Yeah, exactly. We were on his team and we won.
We won, yeah, we crushed them. So that was good. But it's very clear to us that this is a huge challenge for our society. And the first part of that challenge is to understand what exactly are those skill mismatches. Where is it that we don't have enough kinds of people, and how do you get that data? Well, I'm looking at a room full of people who can work on that. So I'd say you guys, I'm glad you're leading that challenge. Alan Blue is playing it. Where's Alan?
Somewhere around here.
Took off.
Yes.
But that is a really big part of the solution to our society's problem. And you guys are well positioned. I think you could be doing more, but I'm glad you're doing as much as you are.
And there's another aspect to this, which is that a company like LinkedIn is in a really good position to help us solve an important, really fundamental puzzle, or answer a really important question, which is, what are the characteristics of a lifelong learner? How does somebody actually manage to do that throughout their career? The dirty secret about our industry of educating people is we have a huge number of very deeply held opinions and theories backed up by an incredibly small amount of data. And flipping that around becomes an important thing to do. Reid, I was debating our mutual friend Peter Thiel a while back, and I disagree with Peter Thiel on almost everything. The one thing he said, it's a lot. He's surprisingly easy to disagree with until you actually confront him, and he demolishes your argument. Yes. But the one thing he said that I categorically agreed with was, everybody says they're teaching critical thinking. Most people are not teaching critical thinking. So how you actually go about building that skill in somebody and having them execute a successful multi-stage career, we don't know very much about that. You guys do.
Yep. Well, we're trying, and we're trying to be data-driven. So let's switch a little bit to society. One of the things that I've watched with some consternation over the last year is kind of this growing thing that's been called techlash, which is, roughly speaking, in a kind of an overly simplistic diagnosis, you have a growing political storm around technology, even if a little bit less popular. Most people like Google search, most people like using Facebook to share things, et cetera, et cetera. But that growing lash is a kind of combination of Republicans who go, at least the current set of Republicans seem to be trying to enshrine the past against the future, in my 2-cent point of view. And then Democrats going, well, wait a minute, maybe this was a problem for the election. Maybe there's a large companies, and large companies aren't normally our friends, and we're listening to the media saying there's all these problems, and so they're coming together. And for me, this strikes me as a highly dangerous thing for the future of society and the world, because while I think there are challenges with technology, technology is a solution, is how you improve it. It's like, how do we get there? Not to say that everything's been perfect, not to say there haven't been the errors, but errors and you learn from. What is your guys' thoughts on techlash? What do you think society should be doing? What do you think politicians should be doing? What do you think tech companies should be doing?
Well,
Erik's got a good 3-part test. I'm going to let him.
Well, no, actually, let me say something. So first, the first digit is that tech is doing amazing things for society. So that's the important thing, is that it's one of the best things that could change so many things in health, poverty, and so forth.
The old joke is that tech progress is the only free lunch economists believe in.
That said, there's unquestionably a techlash, and it's not just made up opinions. There's some real challenges, and I think tech companies have been remiss in not getting in front of these challenges. And let me I know Andy gave advice not to give a 6-part list. I'm going to give you a 7-part list. Really quickly, though.
We're just avoiding 6.
Right, no, that was not the point of the anecdote.
Right, I misunderstood. So very quickly, so there's an economic challenge that so many people are being left behind. Median income is stagnating by most formal measures. There's a related thing that big companies are getting there's a lot more and more winner-take-all markets because of networks. Reid has written a lot about this, and that leads to a concentration of power. A third thing is that there's a cyber risk, that as more and more of our infrastructure is digital, we become much more vulnerable to whether it's flash crashes or hacking or attacks. A fourth thing is that there are a lot of developing countries that have had as a plan for the past 40, 50 years to do a lot of low-wage labor that allows them to catch up, and it's worked for some countries, China, Korea, and others, but that bridge is being taken away right now because machines can do a lot of that kind of labor. So those are 4 economic challenges. There are also 3 other political challenges I'll touch very quickly. One is privacy. Our phones, the Internet of Things, we're just constantly broadcasting a stream all about us. There's cameras in more and more cities that have face recognition, and we're in a new world where we don't have the kind of privacy that we once did, and that can be abused by companies and by governments. There's issues around algorithmic bias. As you have machines make more and more of these decisions, they typically learn from human decisions. And as we were saying earlier, humans make flawed decisions. So that is a risk as well if you embed them into the machines. Now, Andy, I think that we can do better than what we did before, but if you just blindly have a black box that mimics what we were doing, well, then you're going to do what we were doing. And then last but not least, there's this whole issue around fake news and amplifying the echo chamber that has gotten a lot of attention. And it's not just fake news, it's taking real news, some bad thing that some Antifa or whatever person said and amplifying it, 10,000-fold or 1,000,000-fold, and trying to get you and him fight to get people angry at each other, and that kind of cyberbullying can be massively amplified as well. So there's at least 7 challenges that I think are real and legitimate that tech companies need to take the lead on and get in front of, because if they don't, it's going to be the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the media, and lots of other people who set the agenda, and probably not in ways that are necessarily friendly to tech companies, but perhaps more fundamentally, not necessarily the right kinds of solutions for society.
Yeah.
This is one of the very, very few areas in politics today where there is some flavor of bipartisan consensus, right? That the big tech companies are bad. and Erik gave 7 reasons why they might be bad, but there's this kind of big, scary bad cloud floating around. And I come across a lot of hippo thinking, people just saying, I'm vaguely uncomfortable about Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and therefore something must be done. That is deeply, deeply shoddy reasoning. And I'm gonna do Erik's test for him. He's got a nice way to think about this and says, look, let's look at the economic impact of this in 3 ways. How are competitors doing? okay, you don't want to make the next social network. You really don't. There's a lot of people saying they're doing free R&D for the giant tech companies, so there might be a chilling effect on competition. What's the state of innovation these days? One of the things you really worry about with monopolists is they tend to stop innovating. There's a store in Seattle now where you put stuff in your bag and walk out the door, and you're no longer shoplifting. I really find it hard to say the state of innovation is dire these days. Those companies are among the world's largest spenders on R&D. And then the third leg is how are all of us doing? How are consumers benefiting out there? We're getting a cornucopia of free stuff. And the biggest knock on Amazon is that the prices are too low. It is really hard to see how consumers are being harmed by this. So if you're batting 667, you should keep going to the plate.
So I'm going to wrap back to one thing actually in the book, because I just realized it was something that we didn't cover that I think would be very useful. The economist advice across this. Like, part of what you're actually packaging is there's actually a bunch of good economics work that actually, in fact, should be wrapped into business practice.
Yeah.
What's the quick summary of that will, I understand the difficulty of the question.
Sure, ask an economist for a quick summary of their work. Let's just see how that goes.
Yes.
So each of those 7 items.
Yes, exactly.
So the short answer is read the book.
Yes, of course.
The slightly longer answer is that in each of them, whether it's the machine, the platform, the crowd, there is some really fundamental economic work on how you do decision making, how you develop platforms and leverage them, how you leverage the core and the crowd. Let me pick one. I'll pick the platform one, and maybe Andy can pick up on one of the other ones.
Platform, that's interesting.
Well, we could
No, do platform.
We can mix and match. I mean, platforms can be thought of a lot of different ways, but one thing that we found very useful is this concept of two-sided networks, and work by Jean Tirole, Nobel Prize winners, and a bunch of other people, our friends Marshall van Alstyne, Jeff Parker, have worked through the economics of two-sided networks. And some of the interesting things is, like one-sided networks, a one-sided network is a phone or fax machine or WhatsApp, where the more other people who are using the same thing, the better off you are. It's not valuable unless other people are. A two-sided network is when there's two different products, two different groups of people, and yet they benefit each other. So Uber, for instance, there's an app that the drivers use, and there's a different related app that the customers use. And the more people that are using the Uber app on one side, the better it is for the people on the other side. And there are lots of other places where you have these two-sided networks. But it turns out that there are times when it really does pay to give stuff away for free, to build the other network, to subsidize. You may even want to give it for less than free. So credit cards actually are a two-sided network, pre a lot of the internet. And originally they used to charge the merchants, they used to charge the customers for the credit cards. But now, I mean, how many people here get paid to use your credit card? Most of you probably do.
Most of you probably do. You have loyalty points.
Yeah, if you get if you get frequent flyer, whatever, they are paying you, if you're smart, to use the credit card. And now it's providing a service to you, but it turned out that the elasticity of demand is such that it's better to subsidize the price to you to free or even less than free, get more of you using that particular credit card, and then they can make more money on the other side of the network, charging the merchants 1%, 2%, 3% fees. And by lowering the price on one side and raising it on the other side, even below zero, you can make more money than if you thought of them as two separate kinds of products. And one of another counterintuitive thing, I think that's a little counterintuitive, is that often by merging two-sided networks, you not only make a lot more money because you can play these kinds of interesting games, it actually can be better for society that there's a net increase in consumer surplus. You're creating more total value by growing the network. So there's a lot more in the book that works through. We even have over our publishers' objections, we put in some graphs and charts, some lines. They told us not to do that, but you can see them graphically, how some of this plays out. And that gives some intuition, because it's not the answer that you just always give stuff away for free. It's not the answer that you never give it away for free. But if you understand the economics of two-sided networks, you can work through when you do it and when you don't.
We had a great discussion with our publisher. We're like, we have to include a downward sloping demand graph in this book. And they said, there's no way you're going to include a downward sloping demand graph in this book. So we fought that battle and we won that one. Another example of the Nobel Prize winning economics that is playing out in real time right now.
There it is.
Mm-hmm.
Check it out.
Yeah, our editor's eyes lit up when they saw that one. Another one that's playing out right now, and I think is a huge open question, is how big a deal is this whole world of distributed ledgers and cryptocurrencies and tokens and ICOs and and
You're avoiding the word blockchain.
and smart currencies and all that, because that's just one instantiation of this broader phenomenon. And it is actually intellectually, not only economically, but intellectually, the most interesting thing happening in the business world these days. I think, how big a deal is this distributed alternative going to be? I came out there's something super interesting going on. Is this going to be a revolutionary thing that makes the company as we know it obsolete? I am firmly convinced that it is not, because there's a set of economics called the theory of the firm, which has yielded 3 Nobel Prizes so far.
At least, yeah. Hart, Coase,
Williamson.
Holmstrom, Williamson.
For like a lot of amazingly solid work on this that gets to the notion of what is it that a company is there for, and how big a threat to that thing called the company is this thing called a blockchain. It's a super deep issue. We wrote about in the last bit of the book, and I came away thinking this distributed world is going to have some impact. It ain't going to make the world of the company as we know it go away.
Actually, I agree with you on that. And I'm going to do 2 more questions, and then there's a mic there if you want to line up for questions. And I know there's an ability to do this online as well. And by the way, I have plenty more questions. So if people don't line up, I've got a bunch of other things to do. But part of the promise that we made, Andy and Erik, was that we get a chance to interact with all of you folks.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to that.
Yep. So first one is, in the book, the one that seemed least developed as an area for recommendations to companies was essentially the crowd, was essentially this new decentralized area. I myself don't really have them, but like the whole notion of, well, you can deploy a whole bunch of volunteers in Wikipedia, you can use Linux as a way of getting a whole bunch of volunteer developers, you can have a non-controlled system, which you did a very good description of the Bitcoin blockchain, kind of like how does this work and what is the actual economics of this work. But the map to, if I'm in a traditional industry other than know this decentralization is coming and the people who figure it out are going to have a huge advantage.
No, actually, why don't you tell the NIH story? You want to tell that? I think that's a particularly compelling quantitative example of how people massively underestimate the power of the crowd, and they still do it. And I think this will help convince you.
There are a couple point things that I think any decent-sized enterprise could do to tap into the power of the crowd. One is if you have a quantitative, tough problem that you're working on, where there is an objective benchmark, just not like, hey, is this a good idea or not? You're going to get junk back for that. But if you have a tough problem and there's an objective performance benchmark, give it to the crowd. Let the crowd work on it. Our buddy Karim Lakhani is a great scholar about the crowd effort at Harvard Business School, and we wrote up a study where the National Institutes of Health said, all right, here's our baseline performance for sequencing the genomes of human white blood cells. Crowd, can you do better? And the crowd kind of went, yeah, all right, give us a little bit on this. They came back 14 days later, and they took the run time from 10,000 seconds to 10 seconds.
14 days.
14 days.
1,000-fold improvement.
1,000-fold improvement, and they took the accuracy up to from 70% to about 80%. The total prize money offered to the geek crowd for doing this was $6,000. So when we read this, I went to Karim and I said, hey man, is this the craziest thing you've ever seen? He said, it's about average. He said, if you can pose a geeky challenge and activate a crowd to work on it, you will get a quantum improvement. Let me give you one more. The other one we got was from a venture capitalist colleague of yours, Mark Andreessen, said, look, for all of history, you had to commit a huge amount of resources up front before you launched a product out into the market. Now, throw it up on Indiegogo or something. Just get a signal about the demand for this thing that you're planning to do. That signal was unavailable to you before, and now it's pretty easy to come by.
And even not just for little companies. I mean, in our book, we talk about GE not knowing whether this ice maker was going to pay off, and they were debating it, and instead of debating it, they went ahead to Indiegogo, and was it Opal? Was that the name of it? And they found that they had tremendous demand. So, but the lesson takeaway isn't just that you get more eyeballs. That's part of it, but it's more fundamental. It's richer than that. It's that the core, the people in your organization, they tend to be similar to each other. They have a certain expertise. They're good at doing insurance underwriting or financial analysis or sequencing, genomes a certain particular way. And so they get sort of, there's diminishing returns doing more and more of the same things. You throw it out to the crowd, you don't just get more eyeballs, but you get people from totally different fields. You get geologists and petroleum engineers and people who are experts in fractals and all these other things.
The fancy term for that is marginality. You get people who are marginal to the discipline that pose the problem.
And many of those other ways of doing it just don't help at all. But some of them, for some of them, it's just a fundamentally different way of looking at the problem that is way, way better. And you say, you know what, if we kind of reconfigure, if we relabel some of these variables, this is a trivial problem that we solved 15 years ago, and boom, problem solved. And so you tap into people who just have more diversity of opinion, more diversity of views, and that's something that's much easier to do now, and most companies way, way underweight that opportunity.
But you can also imagine how thrilled the core is about the crowd.
Yes.
This is not the R&D department typically does not love it when you show these results to them. So it's really managerially difficult and subtle to start reorienting the company and not making the R&D department feel they're going to be fired next week, but gang, we're going to reach out to do this thing that we hired you to do. We're going to reach out.
And now there are platforms, speak of which, to do this kind of question. You guys all probably know about Kaggle and the ability you can go there. And one of the things that Kaggle does isn't just tap into this network of people, but they help you reformulate, reshape your question so it's in a form that can be addressed. Andy said up front that you really need to have something quantitative that you can go after. You can't just say, hey, how can we be better? That's not going to work.
Yeah.
But if you have something that you can define precisely enough, and people like Anthony Goldblum can help you, or he'll say, you know what, that question's just not going to work. Just go away. But often he'll help you reshape the question, or their team will, in such a way you can tap into that power of the crowd.
The crowd interface is a new capability that companies might want to spend some time working on.
So I'm going to punt, because we have a long line of questions, I'm going to punt on fake news and advertising business models. We might get back to it. That was my last question. But I'm going to wait and do these questions first. Please start.
Hi.
Mike?
Mike?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shankar Venkatraman, LinkedIn Talent Solutions. Thanks for joining us, professors. Really appreciate it. I was at the C-Sales event in November. Both of you spoke. Alan was there. Loved it.
IDEC sale event.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Co-branded.
Not co-branded well enough, I guess.
One thing that came out for me were Kai-Fu Lee's presentations.
Yes.
It was pretty provocative, and you guys had, I felt, pretty compelling counterpoints. I don't think he was there to listen to that. I think this audience would benefit from your take on that, both Kai-Fu Lee, where he's coming from, where China is going in terms of the massive amount of data platform. I mean, what we do in the US is orders of magnitude smaller than what's going on in China. What are the implications for the society and possibly the reformation of government globally?
So, like you just pointed out, our colleague Kai-Fu Lee has a lot of exposure to the AI efforts in China, and he kind of frames it as an arms race going on, and he says China is extremely well positioned to succeed in this arms race. I don't know how valuable it is to think about an us versus them situation here. It doesn't feel to me quite like the nuclear arms race. But let's take that framing, and how are we doing here? I actually had the chance to ask this exact question to Condoleezza Rice and David Petraeus a while back when they were on a panel. So I'm just going to channel their answer. They said authoritarian societies really are not great with crazy off-the-wall thinking. It's just kind of what they're not set up to foster. And real breakthroughs in this discipline of AI are going to require some fairly radical, some fairly innovative thinking. We also have a colleague back at MIT named Doron Esamoglu who co-wrote a wonderful book called Why Nations Fail. And he says, look, if you have authoritarian states and their economic institutions are inherently kind of extractive, you should not be long on that. So for those reasons, while Kai-Fu makes excellent points, and they're going to throw a lot of very, very talented, well-trained people at this problem, I vote on free societies for dominance in these geeky fields long term.
So just for fun, I'm going to disagree with Andy, even though we mostly agree. And I used to was very convinced by Doron's work and by that general argument. I hope I want it to be true, but I'm becoming more and more worried about the things that Kai-Fu brings up. And just to put some numbers behind some of what you said, take a guess right now, the amount of mobile payments on phones in the United States versus China. What do you think the ratio is? Obviously they have more people, we're a little more developed, we're richer. So, if you took the number of payments to Apple Pay, et cetera, versus China, what is it, 1 to 1, 5 to 1? What do you guys think it is? Do anyone want to shout out a guess? 50 to 1.
50 to 1.
50 to 1. They have a thriving mobile payment ecosystem that is just leapfrogging us. I was just at AAAI, the AI conference. Last year, the number of submissions of research to AAAI from American versus Chinese authors was about even. This year, 50% more submissions to AAAI from Chinese than American research. AAAI used to stand for the American Association for Artificial Intelligence. By the way, they changed the name of it. It's now the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. Because they realized that this is not just an American thing. So, and there are many examples, people, Andrew Ng and others, of pointing out that in a lot of areas, plausibly, AI researchers in China are doing as well or better than researchers in the United States. Now, disproportionately, to agree a bit with Andy on that, disproportionately, they were, the ones at AAAI, for instance, were mostly in applied machine learning, sort of maybe not the more fundamental breakthroughs. I'm not the right person to judge that. But there tended to be more applied aspects of it. And so there may be some element of that you do have a harder time doing the more fundamental breakthroughs. But I think this is a real challenge. But I'll end on a point of agreeing with Andy that I hope we don't think of this as a nuclear arms race, as an us versus them. If they figure out a way to cure cancer or Parkinson's or have better self-driving cars or whatever, I think mostly that's going to redound to the benefit of all of humanity. Likewise, as we make those kinds of breakthroughs, and if we can maintain an attitude that, hey, trade and research and innovation is something that's good for the world and not something that's...
That's our bigger challenge in this country, right? Like maintaining those attitudes.
Yeah, and that's an economic and political and cultural challenge more than a technological issue.
Amen.
Morning. Andy and Eric, thank you for joining us, and Reid, thank you for inviting them. I have a two-part question. 2 weeks ago, there was a Bain & Company report about the future of labor and labor trends, and they had their own three around shifting demographics, baby boomers retiring, so it's going to lower supply of labor. 2 is around automation impacting 20 to 25% of low and middle skill workers, which is going to increase labor supply. And 3 is around the widening economic inequalities that those first two are going to create. So first part is, would love to get your thoughts on crystal ball, where you think the workforce is going to be impacted, if you have your own prediction of what percent is going to be displaced, and just trying to get a sense for that. 2 is then, it's music to my ears when you talked about LinkedIn and your challenge of how we can do more. We've been thinking a lot about this as a company. We acquired lynda.com, got into online learning. So I want to get your sense of what can we do, you talked about skills gaps, to help these low and middle skill workers who will likely be displaced by some of these technologies. What can we do proactively to help them? I would love to get your thoughts on both of those. Thanks.
Let me take the first one, because that's actually the easier of the two questions. Our colleague Bob Gordon has the best way to phrase what's going on with the labor force these days. He said, we do not have a job quantity problem. The robot apocalypse that ends all, that brings on massive technological unemployment, it's just not in sight in the data at all. We have a job quality problem. And our colleague David Otter has done a beautiful job of driving home the point that our job creation engine used to kick out a lot of really good old-fashioned, solid American industrial age middle-class jobs, and it was great. It's kind of downshifted, and now the sweet spot appears to be kicking out lower middle-class jobs, more precarious, less well-paid, fewer benefits, all of that stuff. What Eric and I spend a lot of time on is how do we tune that engine up, how do we get the sand out of it, whatever, and give it the best possible chance of getting back into that proper higher gear. I personally think it's way too early to give up and say, well, we need a universal basic income because the robots are going to take all the jobs. That's a super overconfident prediction. History should make us really, really uncomfortable about making those kinds of predictions about tech unemployment. And there are a bunch of things we're not doing in the economy that any economist would say we should be doing to try to create the economic environment to let the engines of entrepreneurship and innovation do what they've been doing for 200 plus years, which is generate a lot of demand for labor of all skills. For me, that's the homework.
What Andy says, 10x, I agree with that. We described some of it more actually in our other book, but some in this book about the kinds of policies. And there's a lot we could do to reskill the workforce, which is the second part of your question. I recently did a study with Tom Mitchell, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, about the kinds of tasks that were most suitable for machine learning, the kinds of tasks that weren't, because we're very far from artificial general intelligence. So that's, we're not doing that. But there are some very narrow, stunningly powerful things that machine learning can do really well that mostly hasn't diffused to the workforce yet. Some of it's begun to hit. And we have like a rubric, a set of tests you can apply to tasks. The nice thing is that the government has categorized the US economy into like 973 occupations, and each of those has about 30 different tasks, like what does a bus driver do, all the different steps. So if you apply the rubric to the tasks, which is a time-consuming process, you can get a sense of how the economy is changing. And I just summarize very briefly. Almost no occupations are entirely affected by this wave of automation, but also almost no occupations are not at all affected. And so our takeaway is that there's a lot of reorganization, re-engineering, restructuring as parts of tasks. Radiologists, reading the images, the machines can do that better and better, but talking to the patient, coordinating with the other physicians, the overall plan, doing a history and physical, all that part is still something that the humans do relatively better. And even parts of looking at the images, there are different types of errors that humans and machines make. So it's a much richer situation where there's not all or none. But if you apply a rubric like that, you can come up with a set of skills that are becoming relatively more important versus less important. And that is, I think, a place where LinkedIn and Lynda and other tools can be used to help shift people in real time or maybe even in advance towards those kinds of skills.
Andy, Erik, thanks for coming. And Reid, thank you so much for moderating so well. So for those of you who don't know, by the way, we are collaborating with Erik and some of his co-researchers on a project for the Economic Graph Research Program, and we already have some results and working papers rolling out, but stay tuned. It's very cool about measuring how the returns to human capital are accruing to companies and to workers across the economy, and there's more great stuff coming, so stay tuned. Nadia would be very mad at me if I didn't mention that. But here's the one question I want to ask. As you guys have talked about, we have all these amazing, potentially transformative technologies that are being rolled out here and in lots of other places in Silicon Valley, in China, elsewhere around the world. And yet when we look at nearly all the economic data, they're not suggesting a world that's transforming faster than ever. It's actually suggesting it's a world that's transforming more slowly than it has for decades, maybe even a century. Firms are forming more slowly. The rate of occupational change has slowed dramatically relative to what it was. Productivity growth is super slow. It's almost a uniform message, which is kind of surprising. What do you think is driving this disconnect between very little economic change and very rapid technological change? And do you anticipate that gap is going to narrow? How long do you think it's going to narrow? I'm curious for your thoughts.
So we'll preview. We wrote an article that hopefully will come out as an op-ed soon called The Coming Productivity Boom. So the answer to your last part of the question is we do think that it's in the pipeline, and it's because the technologies that we see as we walk around in terms of machines being able to do image recognition as well or better than humans or understand speech or just a whole panoply of particular skills is awesome. But we also, despite all the investment in, say, I don't know, self-driving cars, you don't walk around, you don't see a whole lot on the street, maybe a little bit more in this neighborhood than the rest of the country, but it's not something that has fundamentally changed the productivity of the country yet. Now, people like our friend Bob Gordon say, well, if you extrapolate from the past few years of somewhat disappointing productivity growth into the future, it's bad news. We think that's a huge mistake. You don't just extrapolate. Past productivity actually has roughly zero correlation with future productivity, and we show that in some of our work. The only way to try to make some predictions, which is always a very risky thing to do, is to try to understand what are the underlying fundamental technological drivers. And when we look at those, we're very impressed. And but it raises the question, well, why aren't we seeing more productivity now? And we think the answer is that this is just the nature of all general purpose technologies. And machine learning, artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology. That's a technology that affects lots of industries, lots of products, lots of services. Earlier GPTs were the steam engine, electricity, the internal combustion engine. In each case, believe it or not, it was about 20 to 30 years between when the technology was first developed and started diffusing till when you started seeing a significant productivity boost. Now, we hope we can compress that a lot, where I think we're better at doing that, but we have to be realistic that in order to take these amazing technologies and reinvent business models and come up with new products and incorporate them and do all of that, we're going to have to take, sometimes it's going to be a lot of entrepreneurial innovation. Now, one of the things that does trouble us that Guy mentioned is that there's a lot more occupational licensing and other sort of sand in the gears of reorganizing the economy right now. It's harder to make some of those changes, and many governments, like the city of Boston, others, they intentionally try to, as Reid said earlier, protect the past from the future by banning, or putting special taxes on ride-sharing services and others. So that doesn't help this process of reorganization. But as we've been saying several times here, we don't think that the issue is with the technology so much as with the economic and social institutions. And one of the reasons we're focused so much on trying to speed those up is to overcome those kind of dismal productivity numbers that we're seeing today and speed up the time to address them. And let me just also just briefly mention, it's been an absolute delight working with the team at LinkedIn. We are so fortunate that you guys have such amazing data, and we are able to, as Guy was saying, figure out how the value of human capital not only affects individual workers' wages, but in our project, we're looking at how it affects the value of firms. And a big chunk of the value of a firm actually depends on the human capital in that firm. So therefore, it makes sense for firms to invest in their employees' human capital and not just say, well, that's their problem or that's the government's problem. And that's part of the story that we're putting quantitative data behind.
Eric and I are both really confident that productivity growth, even with the measurement problems, is going to improve sooner rather than later. We've got an op-ed coming out to that effect. I'm a lot less confident that business dynamism is going to turn around and start getting healthier in America. People are moving less often. There are fewer new businesses formed. Entrepreneurship is on the way down. Any measure you want to look at the dynamism of the US economy has been on a long, slow, steady decline. The scary part is we don't quite know why. And one of our colleagues, John Halterwanger, has a great description. He talks about it as death by 1,000 cuts, which is kind of unpleasant to me because that means there's not just 3 magic things you do to turn it around. But I think part of our homework should be trying to figure out how to turn the corner and get our previous levels of dynamism back in the economy. Extrapolating from what you all see around you all day is a deeply bad idea. Silicon Valley is not America. I sounded like a campaign ad for a candidate that none of us would want to vote for. and I apologize for that. Don't take the wrong message, please.
Hi there, guys. Thanks for coming out, first of all. I'm Thomas. I'm a machine learning SRE, I guess. So I deal with this quite a bit. I have 2 questions. First part is, so a well-known economist, Mariana Mazzucato, she talks about the cycle of research and how it relates to industry, right? So the traditional model is you have the US government funding, using public funds to create research and to do R&D, DARPA, for example. And you have companies, private, like Apple, Facebook, Google, all the internet companies, using this research for free, essentially, and then building and making great profits off of this. So the first question is, how do you think machine learning, all that stuff, is being investigated, one, by the US government for benefit of all people, and how do you think that's kind of shifting with the kind of evidence of these public conferences and more public papers and more information sharing between companies for the actual public? And the second question is, in terms of education, democracy is all based on voters being well-informed, and with technology growing at an exponential pace, how can the common voter be expected to be informed on these decisions and vote for policymakers that are also informed? We're having trouble with FCC and Title II regulations, right? They don't understand what the internet is. What are your guys' thoughts on how to better educate people and policymakers?
Yeah, let me do the latter because I think that's the harder question. So I'll take the bullet on that one. This is a really, really tough problem. In both a narrow sense and a broad sense. How do you educate somebody to be a decent consumer of facts is a really tough problem. And if anything, again, to agree with Peter Thiel, I think our ability, or even our willingness to try to teach critical thinking is heading in exactly the wrong direction. And a lot of what we're doing instead is teaching indoctrination, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. Finland, for example, apparently doesn't have much of a fake news problem, and they're right next door to Russia because they have done a good job of educating their populace to be able to look at a claim and evaluate it and say, well, no, that actually makes no sense at all. So it's doable, but it's surprisingly hard, and I completely agree with you. The urgency of doing it is increasing because the pace of change and the pace of tech is increasing, and it is not the case that the sane side of the argument always wins. Sometimes the crazy wins the argument. The official position of the US government is that climate change, man-made climate change, human-made climate change, is not a thing. The crazy won the argument for a long time about vaccines. The crazy is winning the argument about genetically modified organizations. And with all respect to Elon Musk, when he talks about summoning the demon with AI, man, I think that's benefiting the crazy side of the argument. And I have seen what happens when the crazy side wins. It's bad news.
So there's a lot of people in line, so I'm going to very quickly just amplify what Andy said and then touch the other one. And these are not meant to be glib, but short answers. I do think that the answer is very much around educating the population. So, when we first started writing these books, we're like, how do we change things? And we went to congressmen and said, here are the things you need to do. And they basically said, I agree with what you're saying, but unless the voters want this, I can't do it. And I have to go with what the voters want. So for better or worse, we live in a democracy, and our leaders will, to a large extent, listen to us. If the people are demanding crazy things, then they're going to be pushed that way. So unfortunately, it has to start with getting people to read our books and listen to you and do the kinds of things that we think will change the conversation in that direction. So that's kind of a lot of hard work, but I think that way that it has to work in our society. On the first point about this cycle that Professor Mazzucato described, I think that she's got it very right that investment in basic R&D has been a huge growth engine, maybe the most important growth engine for a lot of technologies. And it's really, I think, economics 101, that there's a public good for basic R&D. That is not something that companies will invest in enough on their own. They don't have the private incentives to do so. So we have to have government investment in the internet and other basic artificial intelligence, and then and fund it in universities and education and government labs and elsewhere. And then I think it's great when companies pick up that thing and develop it and create products and services, and they have a private incentive to do that, and they become millionaires and billionaires. Bless them. That's the way more or less the system is supposed to work. That there's an incentive to pick up that technology and commercialize it. And then ultimately, to close the cycle, then you have to have a tax system that takes some of that money that's been generated and uses it to pay it forward for more R&D and research. So that's the economic 101 paradigm, and I buy into it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. So I think we've seen that machine learning it's easy to apply it to problems where the objective is clearly standardized, the inputs are standardized. There are a lot of human problems where that's not necessarily true. I think one really good example is the world of online dating right now. There's been a lot of approaches to introducing algorithms, collecting more information from people on both sides to create matches. And there has been some success, but there's also been a lot of papers that show that these algorithms are not significantly better than randomly matching people.
Huh.
And the reason
or just getting drunk in a bar and seeing what happens.
So the reason I think a lot about this is I'm a PM on the jobs team, and the match between a candidate and an employer is actually not that different. I think we like to think that there are a lot of standardized criteria, skills that people are looking for, but what we've found is that recruiters a lot of time use judgment that they cannot explain to talk about a culture fit or someone just clicking, kind of similar to on online dating. Sometimes there's just a spark that can't be quantified by similar interests, right? So I would love to hear kind of your take on why you think dating or honestly like employing sites haven't been able to crack that match, even given all of the data we have, whether that's we haven't standardized things properly or we don't have a complete understanding of a matches. But would love to hear your thoughts on that.
And I don't know this literature that you're referring to in great depth, but one thing I do know is that finding someone for a job like finding a date, looking for that spark, looking for that chemistry, is demonstrably a terrible way to go about it. Because it turns out if you're interviewing me for a job, the main thing that makes you likely to hire me is, do I remind you of you? Man, that leads to a monoculture, that leads to all kinds of discrimination. It's a terrible approach. I think a much more algorithmic or evidence-driven approach toward finding people to bring into the company with a light overlay of, is this person a good fit for our culture, is the right way to go. I honestly don't know if that applies to the spark, the chemistry of finding a life partner. Those are two different activities.
Yeah,
I have found my heterosexual life partner, and I would not use an algorithm to try to get this to happen. Go ahead, run with
Leave
that.
that there.
Yeah. You're doing these one-liners.
It was not in a bar, by the way. And we were not drunk. Now, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Getting
It's
silly.
hard to dig back out of that.
Dig back out of that, yeah. I think that the answer is somewhere between. That I do think these systems can do a lot to improve our decision making. They're not perfect, and if we expect them to just completely say, okay, here, this is your person to hire, and this is your life partner, whatever, we're going to be disappointed. The question is, can we do better, and can we combine human and machine decision making to improve? I think, and the example I gave before of the tenure committees is an example of that. That there's on balance too little use of data, and it's not just that matches are imperfect. There are these biases that Andy brought up from human decision making that I think are often worse from the human approach than the ones that are supplemented by data. But it's something that clearly needs more work.
Unfortunately, this is the last question. So the next question, but we're literally at 24 seconds, so we'll go a little over, but last question.
Hi, thanks again for coming in. This has been really fascinating. You talked about retraining people and how powerful tools like online MOOCs and online tools can be in retraining the workforce given the speed of change. How do you think about folks for whom we can't retrain them? Maybe they're too old, maybe they don't have some of the prerequisite education. To what extent do you think there will be a population who truly has a kind of, or become a sort of useless class? Or folks, I hate the word, but it's from an economic standpoint, like folks who don't have a skill set that can be used in the workforce. And how do we think about providing opportunity for them, both economic and a kind of like moral dignity for those folks who don't have work?
I think there are very few people, if any, that are in that class, to be honest. I think that the problem we're facing today is not that we don't have enough work that needs to be done that can be done by humans. I think there are machines, amazing as they are, and we spend most of the panel talking about the capabilities, there's still so many things that only humans can do well, and there's no shortage of problems that can only be solved by humans. And I think that the first order approach is to be more creative and think harder. It's really a failure of imagination to the extent that we aren't putting a lot of these other people to work. Whether it's in healthcare and childcare or in creative kinds of work, interpersonal skills, team building, a lot of things, cleaning up the environment elsewhere. There are so many tasks that can be done by many people, including disabled people, that need to be done, and we need to, I think, work hard on that. So my instinct is to push harder on that, use things like the Earned Income Tax Credit to encourage employers to put people to work in those areas, to do the reskilling and think about the kinds of jobs that still need to be done. And I think we're pretty far from a world where masses of people just have no way of contributing to society. I can imagine, and I've read enough of the literature that someday machines will be at that level. That is not the challenge I think that our society faces today, and I don't want to distract us and think we're going to write off a whole bunch of people when we probably have so many problems that need those people to be working on them, and let's work on doing it that way instead.
If you look at the evidence, you'd think Erik is wrong, because there is a large group and growing group of people who are in exactly the situation you described of on the sidelines of the economy with apparently nothing to contribute. And they tend to be prime age, middle-aged, less educated men. And the labor force participation rate for that group is at a post-war low, I believe, and has not seen much of an uptick even as the economy's continued to tick along. So you'd look at that and think that's nice what he says. It's actually dead flat wrong. He's completely correct, because what we're not doing, for example, is making an infrastructure plan for America that would put those folk back to work doing jobs they really want to do, like good old-fashioned brawny American hard hat jobs. Let's repair our bridges and our ports and our highways and our airports and our the heating systems in all of our schools and stuff like that.
Robots can't do any of that.
Robots can't do any of that. They'd be an investment in the future of the economy, a very good investment, and it would put these people back to work. So I categorically, this is a bad note to end on because friction is always fun. I categorically agree with my co-author. There is no shortage of work now and for a decent time into the future. That if we just would tweak some things in the way we match people to jobs and spend public money, we could solve these problems.
And so you now have a very good sense of why Erik and Andy are two of my favorite people. Let's thank them for joining us.
Thank you, Reid.
Thank you, Reid.
Are you going to come up? Okay, then I think we're good.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
to all of you.
Thanks for coming. It was really nice
Pleasure.
of you.
Yep.